I think it's 2 o'clock now, so we'll start here. My name is Elisabeth Braw. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And this is a very interactive session, which is why we have this sort of school-like circle so that everybody gets to participate. And so I would invite those who are not sitting in the circle to join the circle. And so I will moderate the session, and Stephen, who is sitting here to my left, who is the real expert on European security, will raise some initial issues that we'll discuss, and after that we'll have a conversation in this circle about European security. And how many people are familiar with Radio Yerevan? One. Okay, so Radio Yerevan was obviously not a real radio station, but a number of jokes in the Soviet Union, the format was... Yeah, join us in the circle here. The format was Radio Yerevan was asked, and then Radio Yerevan answered. So Radio Yerevan was asked, will there be a third world war? And Radio Yerevan answered, no, but the struggle for peace will reach such a degree that there will be no stone left intact on earth. And it seems to me that we are in the mighty struggle for peace now, which everybody wants. But in the meantime, we have a lot of stones that are not being left intact. And that raises the question of whether we are doing enough to pool our resources and efforts here in Europe to jointly defend our countries. And with that, I'll pass the microphone or the word over to Stephen, who will raise a few questions that we'll discuss.
Yeah, we're getting used to this format ourselves. It's a bit of a decision in the spur of the moment. This actually doesn't facilitate things because you don't have any microphones, and it suggests that we should talk, but this is a workshop. You came to work. So we count on you. In fact, Elisabeth is just a moderator. I'm just a humble rapporteur of what we'll together come up with.
Yes, you'll have the brilliant ideas, and Stephen will write them down, and I'll watch the process unfold.
Yeah, but we will give you a little teaser. The topic is, of course, to be framed from a security perspective, and under the overall theme of the conference, which is "Better Together?" ? So, in terms of defense, which I think, or security and defense, the questions as they have been framed look at both internal or homeland security, territorial defense, if you wish also, as well as external security and defense, expeditionary forces, humanitarian intervention, border management with military means or paramilitary means, etc. And the question, of course, is in the European Union, which is a peace project at first, and where the security and military arm of the European Union's persona has been the least developed over all those decades. Even if in the very early days of the European integration process there was agreement between a handful of states, to create a European defense community, which then didn't see the light, of course, because of ratification problems in the Assemblée Nationale. Vivien, come and join us in the circle. Okay. So initial attempts were then, outflanked, it seems, by other regional security organizations. Of course, the Western European Union, which was later then collapsed within the CSDP, the Common Security and Defense Policy, as we have it now. And in parallel, in a different form of membership, of course, NATO, with the strong backing of the United States, and also on the other side of the continent, Turkey. which have posed their own problems in a way, as we can see them unfold nowadays. But focusing on the European Union, where there's been so much talk about strengthening that, enforcement arm of the European Union so as to rebalance its economic might, its commercial prowess with the security and defense component, there's been a lot of talk but very little walk by the member states. And the question is, okay, in the current security setting that EU member states find themselves individually and collectively, what is the best way of cooperation and or integration in the security and the defense field? And again, security, both homeland and external. Some of the guiding questions which we could touch upon when dealing with those blurry areas of internal and external security are, of course, triggered by the recent events that we've seen in Paris and in Brussels, as indeed elsewhere around the continent, also in previous years. They deal with terrorist attacks, of course, and the question whether the EU's response as a collective has been the proper one to prevent, to combat terrorism. We could question the role of Europol in this respect. We could question whether, a policy action in response to the two most recent attacks, which was to agree again on increased rules on passenger name records, exchange, whether that is the proper answer to the problems that Europe is facing or individual member states are facing. Should the EU create its own central European intelligence agency, its own CIA? And in a more hard security sense of things, we've seen, of course, immediately in the wake of the Paris attacks, President Hollande and members of Premier Valls' cabinet speak out very aggressively, almost in a new conservative Bush type of manner, about the attack under which France was and the war which was being waged upon us, and the war that now would have to be waged upon those terrorists. The invocation, of course, also of the very first time of the European Union's mutual self-defense clause, Article 42, paragraph 7, in a very intergovernmental way, not using the EU institutions, which could perhaps have been used, also not just the European External Action Service for coordination between member states, but perhaps also on the basis of other legal provisions in the treaties, the European Commission, so as to use in a more comprehensive approach, which is, the name of the game, it seems, in the EU global strategy, all the tools that the EU has at its disposal in order to effectively respond to security threats. So how has this panned out for France? What kind of responses has it received from the other member states? It was in the lead, it seems, in also coordinating this. We know that Germany and others, have joined ranks in the bombing campaign against ISIS. But what else has been mustered in terms of support? Intelligence, was that shared? How should we structure? Which member states have been most active? How have they structured their cooperation? And could this be done more efficiently, more effectively at the European stage? Meanwhile, in the whole Brexit context, UK newspapers have leaked ideas that Germany, and especially its defense ministry, is actively working on the concept of a European Defense Union. Much like the idea of closer cooperation between member states using the institutions in an energy union. energy security, defense, the logical train of thought goes on. Is that realistic? Is that perhaps a divisive issue in Europe? Which member states would Germany think, would rally behind that idea of enhanced cooperation, which is a legal mechanism, that provides for stronger cooperation in the security and defense field? Is that a way forward? What would be the contours and the mandate of such a closer cooperation in the defense sphere? Not even questioning whether we should create, European Defense Union next year, but maybe as a long-term goal. What is the role of the defense industry in this respect, European defense industry? And what would be the role of the V4 countries in that context? The battle groups were mentioned yesterday a couple of times in the opening speeches. There is a standing cooperation there, but they've never been triggered. They've never been launched as such. And I guess the meta question is, can the European Union indeed, provide that extra layer of security, both internally and externally, for its citizens? This is one of the objectives, for which the European Union was created, and for which is explicitly written into the treaty. So, is the European able to do that? Is the European Union able to do that? And if so, how can it best do that? And the how question is, of course, what I want to report on tomorrow during the opening plenary.
So with that, the rest of us will start working. If anybody has any immediate observations, feel free to raise your hands. And we'll use the Slido app, but I think it's more interactive to just ask questions in person, so we'll do that as well. Offer contributions in person, so we'll do that as well. No, go ahead.
My name is Martin Valentovic. I'm from Bratislava-based think tank. I was thinking about these topics of security, and what came into my mind that I think the most effective system to be secure in Europe is first that each country have to be able to protect, to build internal security mechanism, and when these countries are strong, so only then they can help each other. Because, for example, when we would build a new European Defense Union, there is one psychological thing that if such exist, the countries will rely on this defense. I think this is also the point, that the members NATO rely that they are very strong, and they do not protect maybe self-defense. So this is, I think, one of the points I just wanted to raise.
And if I could raise a point as well about European CIA, I think if it were to become anything other than a paper tiger, it would have to include just selected countries, because intelligence is obviously, by definition, the most sensitive information any country has, and so to share it with every single member of the EU would not be possible, or at least countries wouldn't share their best intelligence, which would render such an agency useless.
Perhaps it's good to cluster first, some observations or some thoughts on the internal aspects of homeland security, or if you want, of course, the external first. Yeah. Up to you. But
okay, so should we
let's structure the debate a little bit?
Yeah, let's start with internal security. And did you have a?
So maybe we ought to clarify what is our working assumption. If Brexit happens or if it doesn't happen. 2/3 of defense spending in Europe is delivered by just 3 countries, the UK, France, and Germany, to a very little extent. So if you subtract Britain from the equation, there's basically nothing to talk about. even more regarding internal security, because the UK is a global intelligence player, and none of the European countries except for the UK is.
Maybe France.
Not a global. The French one is.
Did I see another?
Thank you. Tomáš Weiss, Charles University in Prague. I wanted to talk about the external security, but when we started about the internal, I will go into the internal as well. I have my doubts about to what extent we are so unsecure internally. And to what extent all this fight against terrorism is in fact a media bubble. And to what extent it is worth going into all this pain and struggle with internal or intelligence agency cooperation, which usually doesn't work even within a state. So how can we expect it to work among states? I have my serious doubts about that. And the EU counterterrorism strategy right from the beginning focused on resilience. And resilience, I think, is much more, or it does include resilience. It does include reaction to the attacks. What should be added is some kind of, let's say, modest reaction by the populations and by the politicians. And I think that much more useful would be to train the populations that simply these things happen and are going to happen. And it simply doesn't really matter what we do. They will be happening again and again because we do not have the power to stop them. We do have the power to stop the history that usually follows. And that, following on your Radio Yerevan's opening, doesn't leave the stone on the ground untouched. But it is not the attacks themselves. So in a way, I think that building an internal security union is rather naive. I do agree that there should be some enhanced cooperation within Europol. Why not? But to expect, I'm a bit afraid that if we just attach our hopes to this kind of European cooperation, we will be greatly disappointed when these attacks happen again. Which is going to happen.
Because it's the last resort, this cooperation, and I'm just arguing on your side now, but if we were to establish it and fail, then what
exactly, there would be,
would be
nothing
the
else to
request,
add
yeah.
as the European Union. So I would rather stop this escalation of action and reaction in a sense right from the beginning because we are somehow shooting ourselves in the foot. Thanks.
That's a nice provocative statement. Gentleman there as well.
Yeah. Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Vivien Pertuzo from the French Institute of International Relations. On the internal security, whether it's a European FBI, European CIA, it will never happen. Simply because even without the British, the French will never want it, and the Germans either. I'm not sure about the fact that France is not a global player, but as you said, the French would disagree. But more seriously, I think that there is a slightly exaggeration when people say that there is no cooperation between the intelligence services in Europe. I think there is a lot of cooperation. The problem is that it's cooperation between very selected members. What's lacking is cooperation, for instance, when there is an investigation going on, you may have the French police cooperating with the other police forces or intelligence services that they know best and that they trust, but not necessarily with the intelligence services or police forces in countries where things are happening, but they have no trust because they know that they don't trust the intelligence sharing to work really well. So there may be here a possibility for the European Union to facilitate, to create some kind of platform. Maybe it could be within Europol. I think it could be a good way
like
for
a
this.
European Five Eyes, maybe.
Well, I'm not sure there would be 5 eyes. No, but I mean, at least a platform where you share only what you want in particular cases. I mean, what will never happen is a systematic cooperation on intelligence. That will never happen. But what can happen is a more structured cooperation. And here I'm not talking about the permanent structured cooperation, but a more structured cooperation between countries that have a vested interest in a particular case or in a particular on a particular issue. And maybe the EU could be the actor that can make everything more reliable, much more trustworthy. Some kind of platform, basically, that can where you can share information in a way that is not really happening right now within the EU, because again, the intelligence cooperation is mostly bilateral or trilateral. It's not really with countries or services that you don't trust. That's the first point. The second point is I agree with the fact that when we talk about internal security, resilience, I hate that word, but resilience is now the name that everyone the word that everyone has on his mind. But what's really important is indeed to, and there the EU has no role at all, to try to make sure that people understand that these things can happen, and there are weaknesses in societies that need to be addressed in different countries, and the weaknesses are different country by country. But again, I'm not sure there's a role for the EU in all this, because this is a very domestic and sometimes very local problem, where the EU has no role, and if the EU were to be involved, I think it would confuse things more than anything else.
What weaknesses are you talking about?
Sorry?
What weaknesses are you talking about?
Well, in some countries, it depends. I mean, here it depends on the issue. In some countries, it could be radicalism, whether it's coming from Islamic radicalism, but it could come from other religious minorities as well. In some other countries, it's just minorities, but not necessarily religious, but ethnic minorities. In particular, in some cases, the Russian minorities in the Baltic countries, or other minorities in other countries. Those are weaknesses that need to be addressed somehow. But on this, I'm not sure that the EU really has a role. It can emphasize the fact that the member states should do something about it, but that's really what the EU can do.
So it could be that the most effective arrangement we'll see is an informal or more formalized smaller group of EU states that just keep trading intelligence between their own members without the EU being involved.
Well, I mean, yes and no. There is this. I mean, it could work. Although I mean, in the EU, which we like to be inclusive, so I don't know who would not want to be part of this group. But there's one thing that could be important as well, and which doesn't really happen. It's more lesson sharing between the member states in terms of practices, in terms of intelligence gathering and things like that. Europol has speeded up the creation of the, if I'm not mistaken, the counter-terrorism center, which was already in the pipeline, but it has accelerated its creation. And this should be a platform where where agents actually share practices, where they basically create some kind of habits of cooperation, of working together, and they build trust to a certain extent between themselves. It's very minor. It's very small. I think it's about 40 people, so it's very small. But it could be the beginning of something.
Thank you. Did I? Okay. Right. The microphone is coming. I think.
Thank you very much. Evan Sven-Louis, Metropolitan University, Braw. Just to add to Vivienne's and Thomas' points, when it comes to external security, for example, Jolyon Hoth wrote that supranationalization of external security issues, the last bastion of sovereignty of the member states. I would say internal security is even worse. I think that member states are very fond of their sovereignty when it comes to these issues, and I do not think that anything such as a European CIA or FBI can actually happen in the years to come. This would be a tremendous bestowal of their national sovereignty upon EU institutions, and the member states, they do not want such thing. Besides that, they do not have the democratic mandate to do something like that. I mean, if the governments, the European Council, the Council of the EU, decide upon the creation of this, I would think that there will be huge opposition on behalf of the European Parliament, first of all, taking into consideration, for example, the European Parliament opposed to and objected to the data exchange of passengers in the past with Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and we had lots of fervent debates there when it comes to these issues that had to do with homeland security issues and internal security issues. That was the rationale behind this, the data exchange of passengers. So in any way, I personally, working on European security governance issues, I don't think this is realistic to think that we can have a European FBI or CIA. Besides that, personally, I also think that it's not legitimate right now to have any kind of this decision. And then a question that we should
Can I interrupt you there?
Yes.
Just to push a little bit on that point. If that is not possible, for the reasons that you mentioned, what would be? I mean, here Vivian gave a few...
I think that the point mentioned by Tomasz when it comes to resilience, I think this is more or less what is the whole idea right now. We see it's not about the terms that much. I mean, if we talk about civil security, if we talk about homeland security, resilience, member states do agree that citizens need to feel secure. So we have more or less, and it is more or less, it coincides with a global perspective as well. Think about the UN Hyogo framework for action that is about building resilient societies. We have the UK and Finland already pioneering, trying to implement the UN Hyogo framework for action. So there is an effort on behalf of the member states. The thing is to what extent they can coordinate and learn from each other, lessons learned from each other when it comes to best practices, when it comes to resilience, firstly. And secondly, I think that we should factor in our analysis how internal security issues are interdependent when it comes to external security issues, because what we have actually seen right now is that we have an external security crisis, the case of the Syrian crisis and Middle East tumult right now, that gets internalized. I think that we unfortunately learned that in a very harsh manner in Europe, in Brussels and in Paris. That's my intervention for the time being.
So in other words, we have to get used to maybe a less peaceful environment as citizens than we have had so far, because preventing every attack is not possible, or would require interventions by the state. Apart from the past 10 years, maybe. Did you have...
Maybe what the European Union can do, it can maybe do the research and support the member states in building maybe some additional security mechanism, like many countries have, for example. The United States have national guards, or Poland is building some involvement of citizens in crisis situation, and maybe this can be one of the solutions which would increase security.
And you're referring now to the development of a European, or the upgrading of the Frontex agency to a European Border and Coast Guard, for what it's worth?
No, I was just meaning the general mechanism of facing or coping with any kind of security crisis, which could be just referring to making the member states stronger, because if each state would be stronger, so terrorist attack would not have place in Europe. So this could be also one solution, and European Union can support it. And I think it would work much more efficient than, for example, these common mechanisms of that security, the common security, for example, that security agency.
Yeah, but I mean, then you would atomize basically what has already been agreed. I mean, are you saying that we should even build down, the European cooperation that has been happening as of yet, or that we should just stop, cooperation where it stands now in the internal security field?
No. I didn't mean that to stop. It's good to cooperate, but to build the additional mechanism. So you can cooperate, and then before you can exchange information, and plus it's possible to support the mechanism of building internal security or the crisis situation, the national based, but in addition, but only the defense type. So I don't know if I said it clear, but I don't mean that to stop the cooperation mechanism and so, but to build the efficient mechanism of, for example, involving the local citizens, but additionally.
Good afternoon. I'm Ondřej Bezděk from Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia. We are speaking about involving citizens in, let's say, responding terrorist attacks or other situations. But then we have a new proposed regulation of the European Union, which will actually, very probably, ban holding of guns for all the citizens. Don't you think that it will take us in a very dangerous situation when quite a lot of ammunition and guns can get out of the control of the governments, out of the legal market? People will be, let's say, not able of self-defense in some situations. I found it quite counterproductive. What do you think about that?
The EU ban that's in process on private ownership of firearms, and you're connecting that to this gentleman's idea of people signing up. Sorry?
I think that even Mr. Weiss mentioned something about that people responding to terrorist attacks. Is it true? Well, maybe a little bit, yeah. I don't speak about direct killing of all the attackers, like in Israel. Just to be trained, maybe to be able to help somehow, to be able to deal with the guns. If you find it, to know what you do with that. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I see the point.
Yeah, so I think the point is that if the EU bans private ownership of firearms, private citizens will be less able to respond to terrorist attacks. Did you have a point?
Yeah, well, if I may react shortly to that, I think if you look at all the statistics, the highest number of people killed by firearms is in the United States, where the regulation is basically very limited or non-existent at all. I think that you might have, if you just spread the firearms and train the people, which it will never do, it will just spread the firearms, the result will be that 1 in 100 terrorist attacks would be stopped by a guy with a firearm, and then thousands and tens of thousands will be shot by mistake, on purpose. So this is exactly, how you basically react and overreact completely. So I surely did not say at any moment that I think that the people should start stopping, that the people should be trained. I think the people should get used to it, which is a completely different thing. And it should be explained to them that these things happen in the same way as earthquakes happen, the same way as car accidents happen. And if we want to save lives in Europe, we should basically focus on different things than terrorism. And we would be much more efficient for much less money and much less controversy in all the terms that have been mentioned here. I would like to react on that, this cooperation and your question whether we should scale down or whatever. I don't think we should scale down. I think we should scale down on the ambitions. I think then that once you boost around with European Defence Union or European Internal Defence Union, you kind of imply that the EU will take over. But it will never take over. Because and we have heard that here by basically everybody, because the member states will never let it take over. So in a way, I think that the discourse is pretty important. And I think that all this small-scale cooperation should continue, and it will be much more efficient in terms of ex post rather than ex ante. And this is something that Europol has been pretty good at. Cooperation when something happens. And again, I will refer to the EU counterterrorism strategy, which I don't really think is a bad document per se. One of the pillars is react. And we need to be able to react. We need to be able to catch the guys when they commit something, or if it is terrorism, if it is whatever else internal security issue. So basically, cooperation and exchange of information, as the gentleman over there said, on case-by-case basis will be much easier and maybe much more legitimate, maybe even than this, all across the board building up of new huge institutions that actually nobody really wants, and they will just somehow imply that the EU is in charge, even though it is not.
Can I just, for the sake of provoking a bit of discussion perhaps on this particular point, I mean, what's the use of asking member states money and resources to build up systems, cooperation procedures, 24/7 intelligence rooms, if they're not going to be used?
It would be an empty agency.
The whole idea is being proactive. You're building it, you're institutionalizing security and security sectors, leads and bases, in case you will need them in the future. I mean, from a long-standing perspective, because as we know, when it comes to the EU institutions, we have always been, especially in the field of crisis management, we have always been accusing of the EU being reactive instead of proactive. I take into consideration that yes, we need to react, and I think that, for example, if we have a look at the apprehension of the terrorists and the attackers, the offenders, in the case of Belgium or in France, I mean, it would be naive to believe that there is no exchange of communication between the member states, like the Netherlands, Belgium, France. There has been this. It's just that this is very sensitive information, keeps being secretive. It makes sense, and it has always been like that. It was always there. On the other hand, when it comes to the issue of being though proactive, is that sometimes you build up your institutional capacity so as to, if something happens in the future, a major challenge, that you can capitalize on this institutionalization so that you can react more quickly. I hope that I managed to cover more or less your question.
Yeah, I still have questions, maybe to tease out this point completely. In a European Union that should be leaner and meaner, that should provide a sense of added value to what member states can do, is it reasonable to believe that the general budget should have lines which serve the creation of procedures, mechanisms, institutions that might never be used? Is that sellable to the audiences that already criticize the European Union for being too big?
Profligate.
Refer to an example of mechanisms that you think that are not used. And I'm not sure whether we're still talking about internal security, because I think that this whole discussion begs for a step towards external security, and maybe there the discussion will be more fruitful. But I mean, like, if you be more concrete and precise, it will give us the opportunity to come back to you in a more precise manner.
Well, it's very hard to imagine, of course, because this is exactly the area of smoke and mirrors, things happen in secret, where information is intelligence and is shared behind behind closed doors and encrypted messages. So I wouldn't be able, to give you any examples. I'm just alluding to the perception that is out there, especially now also in the Brexit debate, about an overpowering European Union, this supranational bureaucratic monster, that is that is deciding for us, and that even has an intelligence room at Rond-Point Schuman. This may feed into an anti-European, Eurosceptic debate, where at a time where we might not want it.
And yet, every time there's a terrorist attack, the public and tabloids say, "Where is the European Union agency that prevents this? And how come such and such country didn't tell the other country what they knew?" We have 50 minutes left, so I thought if we spend half an hour on external security, we'll be able to. That will give us some time to summarize what we've talked about, and for you, maybe Stephen, to make some observations as well. So, unless there are objections, I'll move on to external security, and if I can start with this question: should the EU get involved more in UN peacekeeping missions as one body instead of a single state approach, which is something that Commissioner Georgieva suggested yesterday as well, I believe. So if we start with that, should the EU as a body, as an entity, get involved in US peacekeeping missions? Go ahead.
I don't want to talk too much, but as there's nobody else. Well, it probably depends what sort of engagement you mean. But frankly, given the fact that the European Union has got problems to mobilize the forces of the member states to participate in the EU missions, the thought that the EU will mobilize member states' forces to participate through the EU in an UN mission is absurd. I mean, that will simply not work. If the member states decide to participate in UN missions, they can. They could have always been there. They, for some reasons, decided not to do it, for some good reasons in many countries. And frankly, I don't really think that the UN is the answer to our security problems. The UN is a problem to some extent, to be a bit provocative, as you wanted. So rather I would focus on making the EU work and the member states work first, and then we can ask about how to somehow align with the UN, or first make the UN work more efficiently.
Could I maybe suggest to build a bridge to what we were talking about before, homeland security, and focus first on territorial security through CSDP, military means, before we move to external. I mean, attacks from the outside, and then a military response, other than responses, the more civilian responses we've talked about. Is there a role for the European Union outside of NATO?
I mean, first of all, when you talk about CSTP, this is an externally oriented policy. I mean, the only case that we have mentioned when it comes to CSTP being used for internal reasons is the solidarity clause that has not been invoked even in the case of Paris attacks. It was Article 42 that was invoked when it comes to the Paris attacks. So I think that to a certain extent, it is very specific that internal security issues are to be dealt by member states' emergency and security services at a national level. So I don't think that we should go as far as talking about how we can use CSTP in order to deal with an issue that is how it's supposed to be dealt at a domestic level. Then when it comes to common security and defense policy, I think that it is very important that we draw the distinction between civilian missions and military operations. Getting back to the question on behalf of the fellow colleague, it is difficult to say that what we should do. The EU, in order to do something when it comes to CSTP issues, as we know, it needs an external mandate, an external legitimizing mandate. And this goes back to Thomas's point that sometimes the UN, because they do not give to the EU the mandate, the EU is either too late to react or they do not react. There was also the case, for example, that we, instead of the UN, they applied for this mandate to the African Union, and they got it, and they managed to react. So, but we have also taken into consideration that this is not something that the EU is going to decide. CSTP is a policy that is forged, designed, and implemented on behalf of the member states. If the member states do not want to do something altogether, the EU cannot force them to do when it comes to such a core intergovernmental policy. That said, it means, obviously, the European External Action Service, they try to lobby with the member states and they cooperate, especially when it comes to civilian missions, because there are practical issues. The civilian mission, the budget comes from the EU. It's easier for a civilian mission to be deployed in comparison to a military operation, because military operations of the CSTP are funded through the Athenian mechanism, but based on national contributions, right? And also have taken into consideration and factor in our analysis somehow the issue of NATO. If we talk to administrators, EU administrators working on CSTP in Brussels, that they will tell you we do crisis management and civilian mission operations, peacekeeping, rule of law, these things. But when it comes to hardcore military power, it's NATO. We have a very clear division of labor when it comes to our friends that are working really close to us in Brussels.
So the fundamental question is whether there is even any point in the EU getting involved in military defense, territorial defense to begin with, and then out-of-area missions if there is no interest, and if given the hurdles that exist, and given that NATO is a good substitute for those countries that belong to NATO.
Is that really a conclusion that we can all endorse? I thought it was slightly provocative, or what you said.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. So we don't need CSDP. No, okay. I think we'd come to that conclusion that but in an expeditionary sense, out of area. And which member states are doing it, and how can they be? Is there a point of being better together there?
Well, there is a point in being better together because we can't do anything alone, right? If you
the French can.
Well, the French
could. They can no longer pay for it.
Well, in Syria they were almost pushed to, but then they chickened out quite reasonably, I think. So even they can't. And I think that the Libyan crisis has shown pretty well that the Europeans can't do anything without the US in terms of real hard power and deployment of forces. But what I wanted to say is that territorial defense, I agree, is completely out of question. We don't need it. There's no point in spending political capital on that.
Then why are the Germans doing it?
Well, good question.
Obviously, don't be cynical about this. They are working on this, and obviously they're doing this with a goal, with something in mind.
Well, but does you mentioned the European Defence Union, but does it necessarily include territorial defence? I think the point is, and I will somehow paraphrase this saying, this proverb that if you hold a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. The problem is that we have got some nails around, but we don't have the hammer, so we can't react to them. So first, I think that unless we have the hammer, we cannot deal with the nails in form of the threat to our territorial integrity or in the form of a regional crisis somewhere around. But we simply are not able to react at the moment. So my understanding of any proposal of the European Defence Union needs to start from within, basically from building up the capacities. And that has been the CSDP idea or ESDP idea from the beginning. It has failed completely so far, because obviously the EU has not the power to push anybody on anything. And for the member states, it seems that free riding is still a good option. But I guess that talking about the European Army or talking about the European Defence Union doesn't really move you anywhere. It doesn't help you much. What really does help you is realizing that you can't do alone and that you need to cooperate in some kind of very small bilateral, trilateral, minilateral cooperation. And only then, when you build up some sort of capacity, you can talk about how to use it. But at the moment, most of the EU member states can't do anything. Then we can give up on the CSDP and ask what the French and the British do. Which would be fair. I mean, that's exactly how the CSDP has so far looked like.
I wonder if there's a case to be made that smaller EU member states are more likely to sign up and actively participate in some sort of defense cooperation because they don't have the same high stakes of national pride as large countries, large member states do. So if Germany could get a number of smaller EU states to work alongside it on these plans, there might be a two-tier system where some EU states cooperated and on these army or armed forces plans, and others opted out. Yep.
Well, I come from the smallest state, from Malta. Okay, so I think I should comment on this one, at least. Well, I won't be sure that small states will quite easily take it up. And the reason for that is that it depends on the politics which motivates it. As an island which is very much in a troubled region, we have to work out most of the time unilaterally our politics in order to ensure our security. And so far, we've been blessed by our politics. We don't know the future because you cannot fight terrorism with armies. You can only fight it once it happens within your borders. And sometimes it's difficult because it's homegrown terrorism. So at the other end, terrorism, like my colleague said here, is not going to go away very easily. But having this idea of a super army or something like that is really a mistake. What we need to do is to sit down and discuss how to offer solidarity in real terms when threats occur, and what plan we would have in action when these threats do occur. Otherwise, you will end up having an army which people want to mobilize. I happen to represent my country as an ambassador, and I've heard it many times said that there are countries in Europe which, when their armies return from peacekeeping missions, they see them as a problem and they want to deploy them again. So at the end of the day, you have to be very careful what an army will stand for. Europe is not, at the moment, its territorial integrity is not under threat. The threat is from terrorism. And we can be together there, yes. We're certainly better together there, if we plan and be able to share what we can share together. Certainly, my country depends much more on other countries sharing knowledge. And when we have done it, we have been able to stop developments. But without that support, we will never be able to do it. So there needs to be some sharing of intelligence, some early warning system to countries which do not have the capability. At the same time, needs to be a plan in terms of what would Europe do if a member state, its territorial integrity, is threatened. Europe needs a plan, yes, whether it would be in association with NATO or other organizations, but Europe does need a plan in the case, especially because of what's happening in the Balkans and what may be developments on the Russian front. So Europe does need a plan, yes.
But no capacities, if I understand it well.
Capacities are there, but they are at the disposal of the member states. The EU can actually use them when it has the mandate on behalf, the unanimous mandate coming on behalf of the member states' governments. On the other hand, these capacities are not suited for territorial defense. Battle groups are designed tactically and operationally to be deployed for short, specific type of crisis management issues. So it's not about projection of force in the American style that we may have in our minds, right? For example, take also in this long discussion about R&D. I mean, we spend nothing of when it comes to R&D in comparison to what their, I mean, like the US is spending. I mean, we cannot launch a war with drones, for example, in the European Union, right? But on the other hand, I do share the problems when it comes to the military operations, and that it has fared poorly when it comes to military issues. When it comes to the civilian branch of CSDP, I don't think that we should be very quick to say that the CSDP has failed. I mean, there are specific issues, for example, security sector reform, rule of law, that there are some cases that we can say, okay, you know something, there is a difference. I mean, when it comes to post-conflict building, state building and issues like that, they have helped. But in this case, you do not deploy military officers. You deploy judges, you deploy judges, you deploy police officers. You do not deploy military personnel, and you do not deploy military equipment, which is extremely expensive. And this is why the member states are always so reluctant about getting this kind of decisions as well. I mean, like, there are also very lots of practical issues behind of creating and establishing a military operation that we should take into consideration. This is why they say we do civilian missions.
I'll just take a question here, and that is, how can one talk about CFSP when there's no agreement on the Lisbon Treaty and no unity on foreign affairs? Who would like to comment on that? Maybe the gentleman in the back.
Yes. I don't know about, maybe not on CFSP, but on CSDP. I think there is one thing that is very difficult for the Europeans, for the EU in particular, is to think of CSDP as part of a toolbox that is at the disposal of the member states. I think there is, and the French are in this boat as well. There is too often the feeling that it has to be grand, it has to be ambitious, it has to do everything. But the reality is very few member states are willing to just focus on one forum, one international organization. They like to have options. And you don't need to have an agreement on a daily basis on everything that relates to foreign policy to use CSDP. You just need to say, on this particular issue, in this particular area, we can maybe launch a CSDP operation, and that's fine to limit yourself to that. If you wait for a common foreign policy to have a common security and defense policy, then you can wait for a very long time to see it materialize. NATO has been more adaptive in that sense. Within NATO now, they understand that they're part of a toolbox. They have many instruments that member states can use, allies can use whenever they want. Yes, it's a political military organization. It's great to have the US on board, but NATO may not be fit for purpose for everything. And CSDP should not be perceived as fit for purpose for everything either. It should be good at certain things. Civilian, military, maybe in the low end spectre of the military operations, but maybe CSDP shouldn't be doing everything. And again, if you want to use CSDP for some training missions in Africa or some monitoring missions in Eastern Europe or in other parts of the world, you don't need to have a common foreign policy for that, and that's okay.
So how is it, now that you're here, sorry to interrupt, now that you're here, how has it worked out for France in triggering its Article 42, paragraph 7?
The Paris perspective is that it wasn't enough. What the Europeans gave wasn't enough. The people that know a little bit the different capabilities that the member states can put forward say, actually, we got a lot more than we expected. It's very scattered. So you have member states that have decided to boost their presence in Mali, but in the UN mission, for instance. The Netherlands is a case in point, or Finland decided to put some troops in Lebanon, in the FINUL, in UNIFIL in English. But overall, if you look at many member states, and the Czech Republic is actually a good, or Czechia, is actually a good example of what a member state can do with the capability that it has. And I think in France, many people forget that most countries have small military. And yes, it's true that 80% of budget defense come from the UK, France, and Germany. But simply because those are the biggest member states. If you look at in terms of population, I think Estonia is the country that spends the most in Europe, and this is completely forgotten. And you cannot expect Estonia to spend 10 billion euros in its defense. It just cannot do it. So I think there is this realization in France that solidarity actually worked, but for the general public, when they hear about a few soldiers going to Mali for the training mission, or in Central African Republic a few helicopters or things like that, they're not impressed. But I think overall, the Article 42.7 was used properly, and I think the French are quite cognizant of that.
If I can just ask a question, I guess. I wonder if the future is in bilateral cooperation between EU member states in defense. So a small country with a larger country, so like the Netherlands and Germany sharing tanks, because the Netherlands doesn't have any tanks anymore. I wonder if that can be replicated to other couplings between EU member states where they can pool resources and obviously then maximize what they've got. Yeah.
Again, Malta has had defense arrangements with Italy since 1979. And they are active. We cooperate together, we take part in missions together, training missions and other activities together. So yes, some member states do have bilateral agreements already with larger states. In terms
How about sharing equipment?
Well, we really don't have that budget to share. But at the same time, we also assist Italy in areas where we can. Like, for example, we have assisted Italy with Libya over many years, and with North Africa, especially when problems arose between Italy and these countries. So really our contribution may be different in terms of military, or what we can do, but this agreement is already in place, so you can see it can happen. And probably Cyprus has some agreement as well. If it's effective as ours, I don't know. But ours has long been standing now. for a long time.
Can I interrupt? Is the enhanced cooperation mechanism in the EU treaty, which then allows member states, to mobilize institutions, procedures, what have you, requires, of course, a unanimous decision in the Council and a grouping of at least 9 member states to go forward. Would you see in any field, both on the internal security front as well as the external, a coalition of at least 9 member states rallying behind a certain initiative?
Yes, I can see that.
In which field would that be?
Well, it would be very much in terms of defense, in terms of when threats arise, when clear threats arise. I think there you can find certain agreements, yes.
So it would be ad hoc, not structured?
Yes.
If I may, when you are talking about enhanced cooperation, you mean permanent structured cooperation? Because on defense it has to be the PESCO.
That's indeed the PESCO in the defense sector, but I used specifically enhanced cooperation also to cover internal.
All the others,
yeah.
Right? Well, I think I will go to your question. I think that sharing equipment is a problem because you always end up with the double legitimation by the national parliament, or triple or quadruple legitimization by national parliaments. And what happens if one of the parliament fails to legitimize, right? To mandate. So this is always the problem. But coming back to better together, I think spending better together is the answer, because you do not need to buy together a single item. It would be quite enough for huge savings to buy together in a single tender, in which, the Czechs can buy 3 tanks, the Slovaks can buy 2, and the Germans can buy 150, or you take it. And in that sense, I think you achieve 2 gains at the same time. One of them is that you buy cheaper, because you simply have the economy of scale, and the second is that you achieve interoperability, because you will have the same equipment or very similar equipment at least. But having said that, this is a long run, right? Because first of all, you need to solve the juste retour, the question of what you will actually buy, if it is produced in this country or the other country, because that obviously brings to the economy quite a lot of money. The second thing is, when do you buy it? Because the member states need the equipment at different point in time. So you need to somehow synchronize the procurement cycles. And this is a long run. This is like decades, right? So I guess, yes, this is the way forward. But you can't really expect it to happen overnight. But this is the only way how you really can develop capabilities, I think, especially with the smaller member states. Even with the big member states, I mean, take the example of the Lancaster House Treaty between France and the UK. I mean, the big procurement things needs to be somehow coordinated by the big member states as well.
For those experts in the room, there is a European Defence Agency, of course.
Such as this.
Well, I wanted to gauge your feeling on where it stands. I mean, it has a couple of pet projects which have been repeated by the European Council. Where does it stand? Does it have a future? Especially on procurement issues.
I think it should. I think that's exactly the venue where this should be coordinated. But again, you can't force the member states. They need to arrive to that agreement or to that concept of doing this together by themselves. And that's why I already said before that I don't really believe, in fact, in PESCO or in European Defence Union or any type of large-scale project, because it needs to work in very small groups of states, because that's where you achieve the agreement easier.
But in the constitution of the EDA itself, PESCO is provided. there is a cooperation going on for the development of a European drone between a handful of member states. Is that not the way forward in terms of procurement and defense capability development?
If it works, yes.
A couple of people want to come in.
Okay, now when it comes to European Defence Agency, I think that Jocko Almond should have been somewhere around talking about how ineffective an institution has been so far. I mean, it is more or less a good platform for national experts, because we have taken into consideration that its intergovernmental structure, the intergovernmental constitution of the agency, right? It is a good forum for experts, national experts, to come and exchange ideas. For example, the big thing has been pooling and share initiative, that it is on paper, it's there. We have some projects going on, for example, air-to-air refueling, etc., etc. Whether it has become a pan-European security practice, I doubt that. We have to take into consideration back to the issue of sovereignty, that European defense industries and standardization, liberalization of European defense industries is a debate that is going around for ages in the European Union, right? So to a certain extent, the member states themselves, as Thomas said, they may not be ready to proceed with bestowing more opportunities and responsibilities to European Defence Agency. Still, as I said, I mean, pooling and sharing initiatives and inspiring opportunities there, the same when it comes to R&D. But on the other hand, whether this has meant to putting in practice PESCO, putting in practice pooling and sharing initiative, it's not there. I mean, as I said, there are a lot of people that are more capable about talking about that compared to me. Another thing that we have to take into consideration is the new train and equip initiative, that we see it coming not from the European Defence Agency that much. It comes really forward not from the Council, but on behalf of the European Parliament, more specifically SEDA and AFET. The Security and Defence Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament have made loads of mentions to how good it would be the train and equip initiative. We could take it on board and further institutionalize it, because unlike pooling and share initiative, this has not been institutionalized yet. So, I mean, there is lots of good willingness when it comes to theory, even on behalf of the member state, but also as the institutions, as I said, the European Parliament. Whether this is posed and whether this is actually implied in practice, there are lots of problems. We're still not there.
Can I just ask, if the synchronization of the procurement cycle were to be sorted out, what sort of conditions would a country with no or very little defense industry set in order to make a joint procurement with a country that has a large defense industry and would procure the particular item from that country? So, for example, I don't know if Malta teamed up with France, or the French government, to buy something from Thales, for example. What sort of concessions? I'm just taking Malta as an example.
But we have used European funds for defense purposes, and that was one way we have mostly developed our maritime ability in recent years, and also some type of fixed-wing aircraft for the purpose of surveillance and reconnaissance have been bought with European support. So really, in terms of a central agency which could help, I don't see that we would be against anything of that sort. But I don't think that we could ever make an impact in terms of what we can ask for, or we're going to help the market to develop.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yes, I think the smaller states would look at what can be provided in terms of for use for the kind of purposes we need them.
I think so far offsets have been used for that. Basically, the country asked with the tender, they said we would like to buy whatever armored vehicles, and part of the offer by the companies usually have been offsets. That means investing in that particular country. I think as long as he stick with that, you will get nowhere, basically. So in the end, there will have to be a political decision that there will not be a juste retour, that you simply will not get the money back. And as a bonus, you will buy cheaper, which doesn't help you much because it will still be quite expensive, especially for the small states, and you will be more interoperable. But it simply, I'm not saying that you do not have to invest political capital into any type of better together. You need, and a lot. And so far I haven't seen it basically anywhere. Anybody willing really to invest political capital into that. Sorry for being so skeptical. I would like not to.
Stephen, it's 3:15. We have 15 minutes left, and I think you need to summarize at some point. But so we have about 5 minutes more for discussion, I think. Is that 10 minutes? Did you have a point?
Not on this, but on the previous, some of the previous points. One is on binational cooperation or trilateral cooperation. It does exist a lot. I mean, Italy and Malta was mentioned, but I think you have the Netherlands is at the core of a network of defense cooperation. The main difference between what the Dutch are doing with the Germans or with the Belgians or even with the UK and what other countries are doing is that the Dutch are going way deeper into military integration in ways that no other country is ready to do.
Yeah, in fact, I was emailing with a colonel, German colonel, who's in that Dutch-German brigade. A Dutch colonel in the Dutch-German brigade who uses a Bundeswehr email address, and I thought this is true defense integration.
No, I mean it's crazy. I mean basically when in terms of tanks, you have to realize that basically if those are German tanks, but if they're deployed, they change the plate and they put a Dutch plate on it. I mean, you cannot go deeper into military integration than that. But and they actually speak German. They don't speak English like you would have in other defense cooperation. They speak German, and not because the German have imposed it, but because it's fine for the Dutch to speak German. But on this, it's complicated to replicate it everywhere in Europe because it requires a specific set of criteria. One being that you've been working closely with this country for a long time, and in the case of the Dutch and Germans, they've been working together for 30 years almost. The Belgians and the Dutch, it's the same. The French and the UK, it's the same. Every country that cooperate with each other know themselves really well, so they trust each other. So that's on the and that's difficult to replicate. The Germans have been at the center of the framework nations concept within NATO, but to a large extent, smaller member states want to be close to Germany. It's not so much that they feel that it could be and maybe I'm misreading it, and please say so if I am, but my feeling is that for the first time in 15 years, Germany seems to be interested in defense, so let's keep the flame alive. So let's cooperate with Germany. And the Czech are cooperating with Germany, and you have 10 countries in Europe cooperating with Germany. But Germany isn't doing this for the sake of Europe, but just to fill capability gaps that they have due to the Bundeswehr reform. So binational, I think it's the way forward, and it's the immediate way forward, but it's complicated because of the difficulties, the political difficulties in particular. On the EDA, once more...
Can I just interrupt? What's the most likely coupling, do you think, after Germany and the Netherlands? Which two countries would be the most likely or most suitable for each other?
Well, everyone is waiting for the V4 to actually do something. Aside from the battle group, in terms of procurements, if I'm not mistaken, there was a radar procurement project, but everyone, and I think it failed because of the Czech. Yeah, well, I would like to hear those reasons, but there are different couplings that can do more. The V4 is one. The Baltic countries is another. They cooperated a lot in the 1990s to get into NATO, and once they enter NATO, they completely forgot that they actually did cooperate a lot. And now, because of the Russian threats, they're starting again to cooperate, but it's very fragile. But for the rest, it's already in play. The Belgians and the Dutch, for instance, it's now they have this project where basically the Belgian Air Force and the Dutch Air Force are doing common surveillance of common air policing, basically, and they can shoot down a plane. A Dutch fighter jet can shoot down a plane on Belgian soil. This is unbelievable. I don't know how many countries can actually accept that, because this is, in many countries, including my own, this would be perceived as a breach of sovereignty. For instance, you could expect maybe Spain and Portugal to do something because they're close together, but they've never really worked together. So I think there is a lot of expectations on the V4 and on the Baltic countries to do something, because their defense budgets are relatively small. From a political point of view, they have fairly similar strategic outlook. So why not do more? But I know it's complicated. And one word on the EDA. I think that the EDA is a good project. But as long as big member states don't want to participate in EDA project, EDA will remain a good agency for smaller member states. And smaller member states can exploit it. It's there. The Baltic countries have used it as a management agency, really, for an ammunition project. So it could be replicated. But on the drones, for instance, yes, it's mentioned as an EU project, but the management is done not by the EDA, it's done by OCCAR. And OCCAR is a good agency for the bigger member states because they're part of it and it's outside the EU. So they can do whatever they want. They control the OCCAR in ways that they don't control the EDA. So as long as the big member states don't want to be part of big EDA project, or at least give EDA big projects, I'm not sure that the EDA has a bright future, but it could be used as a management agency for countries that don't have good bilateral or trilateral management agencies.
Yep.
One between Greece and Cyprus. That when it comes to military issues, they are very much interdependent, taking into consideration that you have Greek forces stationed all the time, military forces stationed all the time, being part of what is called the Greek force in Cyprus.
Good point. I'm just curious which other countries are represented here. Since we're talking about national defense, I think it's fair to talk about individual countries. But I'm just curious what other ideas are out there with regards to these bilateral couplings in the defense sector. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, maybe most extensive practical cooperation is between the Dutch and Belgian navies, which basically have a joint naval command. And actually, the Belgian Navy is nowadays populated with the ex-Dutch ships, because Belgium would have never been able to procure such high-end systems in itself. So that's the best possible example. The worst possible example are the ad hoc weapon system transfers, which we are managing terribly in Europe, or we're basically not managing them at all, because when the UK Royal Navy was massively downsizing a decade ago, the three best ships which could have been sold to any European navies which are in dire need for high-end units, they ended up in Chile. Because obviously it was an opportunity of a lifetime for them. And the same goes for the two French Mistral amphibious ships, which were freed up because of the imposition of sanctions on Russia. Again, the capability is badly needed in Europe. The problem was those were a bit too big-ticket items, so they ended up in Egypt. Again, out of the continent.
Yeah.
You cannot legislate for anything that might happen. I think what countries need to do is to be aware of what they can do. When you asked about Malta, for example, what it can do, what it can contribute, it may not apparently contribute for a peacekeeping force, may not apparently a military force, but if people remember the Libyan crisis and people forget that Malta, using its national airlines and its national ferries, rescued 1 million foreigners from Libya during the crisis. I think nobody ever talks about such contributions, but the fact is that our national airline, our pilots, our air stewardess went into Libya to bring out foreigners. And we brought out about 1 million of these foreigners from Libya in the period which was the war was going on. So I think people have to decide, what can we do? We contribute to peace continually in Libya. We help to broker talks. We do as much as we can. Sometimes we don't find enough support in Europe because some people think only the solution is military. We have helped Tunisia in its quest for stability. So there are things which we do. We have helped to rescue hostages in Libya using our knowledge of Libya. So at the end of the day, I think each country can only contribute in specific areas mainly, like especially small countries, and in areas which has built expertise. And our expertise is not military, but actually diplomatic. But it's very quiet, it's very subdued, but it works.
So I think the summary, if I may summarize in one sentence, is ad hoc cooperation. But now that we have 5 minutes left, I'll let you summarize, Stephen.
Thank you for doing my job.
Two
okay,
words.
I can't do justice to what I think was in the end a very good debate. I'm happy we organized it as such. The discussion started basically with a question. You know, are we really that insecure, or is this media hype? And should our governments, prepare our populations better to basically spread the message that there will always be occurrences, terrorist attacks that cannot be prevented. There may be a political responsibility there. Second, I think the overarching conclusion is that, indeed, to quote Howard, these are the last bastions of state sovereignty. In principle, member states do not want to attribute more competences to the EU in that field, nor do they have the democratic mandate to outsource several of those security fields or cooperation in those security fields. It would be wiser perhaps to scale down on some of the ideas, plans and objectives which are floating around there about further cooperation, integration even at EU level, and stick to the realities which govern both politically as well as in security terms. The fields about which we're talking. Those fields are both internal and external. On the internal side, homeland security, I think the stepping stone was the short discussion on the EU anti-terrorism strategy, which is all about building resilience and the ability to increase the ability of member states, with EU supporting mechanisms to react and cooperate ex post rather than for the prevention of crisis, and this has primarily to do with the lack of trust which member states have in sharing intelligence between them in peacetime, in not crisis mode, so to speak. They will do so on a case-by-case basis where trust exists between smaller clusters of member states, but it is a fiction to believe that there will be creation of a European CIA or FBI anytime soon. Some member states will actively oppose it. But there is a lot of cooperation already, of course, happening between selected member states where intelligence sharing works, is not leaked, and again is based on trust. What is then the role of the European Union in this context? Well, the European Union could, in a more structured way, offer the platforms, institutions, procedures for crisis response, as well as perhaps early warning mechanisms. It could support member states in drawing lessons learned. The role of Europol could also be extended in the sense of training in this context, but it would all have to start rather small. On some of the root causes at home, especially in tackling homegrown terrorism, such as religious or ethnic radicalization, the EU does not have competence. This is where member states essentially have a role to play. But here too, perhaps, the EU could play a role as a lessons learned hub. As far as the external field is concerned, we started with a discussion on territorial defense, where there seems to have been general agreement around the room that there's no role for the European Union to play. This is supposed to be dealt with at the national level, it was said. NATO, of course, is the prime guarantor for territorial defense of at least 22 of the 27 and 28 member states, or is it now 23? Okay. 22, 23. Article 42, paragraph 7, the mutual assistance clause has of course been invoked once, but in an intergovernmental way. The view from Paris is that this has been sufficient, that solidarity has worked, even if the delivery of means has been rather scattered and in various theaters. So CSDP, really, military CSDP is really only for external deployment, of course also civilian CSDP, and we've talked about that, and that is where the emphasis of the European Union has lied and will probably continue to lie, at the lower end of the spectrum, of the violence intensity spectrum. I try to find a way through my notes here. But the EU has had problems to mobilize forces from the member states for CSDP missions and operations, and it cannot force member states to deliver. In fact, there is also the realization that no single member state can go it alone anymore. Even France can no longer pay for it anymore. So the way forward is, it seems, minilateralism through the EU or not is the question. Of course, minilateralism exists at many levels. Here, Germany and the Netherlands seem to be key, even if other bilateral or trilateral cooperations between smaller and bigger member states exist. For Germany, this is essentially, for the aim of modernization of the Bundeswehr, not necessarily with loftier European objectives in mind. But such minilateralism will especially help in the procurement, in the synchronization of the procurement cycle. Here, the role of the EDA was, of course, discussed as primarily being a vehicle for as a management agency for small member states rather than the big ones who seem to prefer to work outside of the EU framework so as to keep control over the development of new capabilities such as the European drone. The V4 cooperation in this respect seems not to have materialized, but there may be future, cooperation with the Baltic states, perhaps also. So enhanced cooperation through PESCO, yes, but perhaps only. First, enhanced cooperation on an ad hoc basis, yes. On a more structured cooperation, more difficult, and probably only in the procurement field, if I understood the discussion well. To end, perhaps, there seems to be still a gap between the ambitions of Euro-federalists and the reality that exists in member states, both in the internal and the external fields. Member states have, of course, different avenues and instruments and procedures at their disposal, and they will choose the ones that fit them best in a given crisis situation.
Thank you very much. And
have I forgotten any major point that should be mentioned tomorrow?
You captured it all in your very neat handwriting. I've been
good.
Watching. I'm the only thing standing between everybody and coffee, so with that we'll wrap up. And thank you very much for contributing. And we have developed a framework for future European defence cooperation in one page. So thank you, everybody. And if we can give a hand to Stephen, who actually did most of the work.
Absolutely. To you.